extremely important subject of the atonement. And I mean that. In fact, I would say in relation to us, in matters relating to us, it is the most significant doctrine in the Bible. You'll remember from last class that we indicated that there are two main doctrines in Scripture. But the first is meaningless to us without the second, which means that the doctrine of the atonement needs to be the focus and motivation for everything that we do. But in order for that to be possible, well, we need to know what we're talking about. We need to understand the principles, the concepts in all their detail. Can't leave it to just a vague idea, like a 30,000 feet perspective. We need to get to ground level and be intimate with every detail on this subject. Now, I want to stress this because I was thinking about this, and in my conversations with some of you last class, we just talked about, that some of the best expositors on this subject, many have died, and some in just very recent years. I mentioned Uncle John last time, but another brother that I often rang to discuss this and other subjects was Uncle Jim Luke. Many a conversation on the atonement. If you wanted to know what book said what phrase, he would know. He read them all and he remembered what he read. In the UK, we had many occasions to speak with Brother Harry Tennant, and another brother that I'm very fond of and discussed on this a lot in Canada, so the North American scene, was Brother Colin Badger. These brethren lived and breathed this subject. You'd go to them and they're gone. Good, solid brethren. But if we're going to be challenged on the atonement every 20 years, something that we mentioned last class, 1950s, 1970s, 1990s, Theistic evolution being the recent one, that means the next challenge on the atonement is not very far away. Who's going to defend the truth next time? How many will be expert enough to stand up for the true principles on the atonement? I really don't know. I'm fearful of that time. Because many just say, I don't really care. It's not important enough. It is important. So this is a bit of an appeal to all of you, but particularly perhaps the young, the next generation, to do yourself a major favour and set aside, 3 months, 6 months, maybe longer, to focus on this subject and to get it under your belt. Because the Brotherhood will be desperate for experts on this subject at some point in the future. And I'd like to think that it will be able to count on many of you here tonight when that time comes. So, to help in that regard, I've just got what I consider essential reading on this subject for those who haven't taken it as a subject. I've brought these books along tonight. They're different editions of these books, so, you might have to go hunting. I've got on there The Blood of Christ. My copy of The Blood of Christ is in the brown book on the atonement, put out by Logos some years ago with other writings in there as well. But The Blood of Christ, essential reading. The Unity booklet, a summary of all the discussion points that came out of reunion when Brother John Carter came here in 1958, and along with Brother Cyril Cooper, brought about reunion in this country, in Australia. I mentioned Uncle Jim Luke. Well, one of the best expositions on the atonements found in the book that he and Uncle Peter Weller put together, the Bible marking course on first principles. There are things in there on the atonement I didn't know existed before 1990s came out with all the problems. Uncle Jim already had it all laid out in the Bible marking course notes there. And of course, Saved by His Life by Uncle John. The first part being a transcript of a talk that he gave on many occasions, which I already mentioned last occasion. At the end of every year, he would often do that talk, and it's all in transcript with the PowerPoints there for you. And then the rest of the book is expanding on that in more detail. So there's many more, but I would say these are the non-negotiable. Like, if you haven't read them, then you haven't done anything really on the atonement. And they're not very big either. They're essential reading. Because the history of the Brotherhood over the last 150 years or so is littered with challenges and attacks on the fundamental teachings of the atonement. And there are multiple theories, many books, articles across predominantly the English-speaking world, UK, North America, and Australia. And most arguments revolve around the connection, the relationship between flesh and sin, between the nature that we're born with and the transgressions that we commit. And everyone agrees that both of those things exist. There's flesh and there's sins. But what's the connection between them? And of course, by extension, this then leads to questions and understandings of the relationship between Jesus Christ and the sacrifice that he made on the cross. Again, both of those things, everyone agrees that they existed and it happened, but why? What's the relationship between Christ and his sacrifice? So most theories on the atonement will delve into and try and explain the relationship between either flesh and sin, and then by extension between Christ and his sacrifice. And although there are multiple theories, essentially this has led to three main views on the atonement. Now, this slide is going to come up a number of times during our series, and while this is looking at the theories and the different views, eventually we want to sort of tease out, well, what does it look like to live those three views? Because that's what our subject title is, living the atonement, not just debating it or questioning it, but living it. Now, I guess that the first two had their sort of beginnings in the Brotherhood back in the days of Brother Robert Roberts. And let's just maybe mention these two here. The first view up there, you can see I've got the word flesh and the word sin, but around it is either a round box or a square box, and there's also a colour, okay? Blue representing good, red representing bad, all right? And black being neutral. To a certain extent, black being neutral. It's neither blue or red, so I just chose black. The first view up there says that the nature we have, the flesh that we bear, has no connection, no relationship to the sins that we commit. Okay? In actual fact, if you try hard enough and you look far enough, you'll find that flesh is actually good. All right? Flesh is good. In fact, God made man with this good flesh. That's the reasoning behind. The second view is the complete opposite to that, where flesh and sin are treated as being identical. In God's eyes and God's view, flesh is seen as being as bad as and needing the same treatment as sins that we commit. They are identical. So same shape, same colour. All right? Whereas the third view says, yes, there is a relationship between these two, but it's a cause and effect relationship where one causes the other. They are not treated the same, they are not seen as being the same, but there is this interlocking between the two, that they can't escape from each other. One is the consequence of the other. Sin came in the beginning and caused mortality. Now, mortality causes us to sin. And we have flesh is weak and inevitably leads to sin. Now, the first view sort of popped up in the Brotherhood in the 1870s when Brother Robert Roberts encountered another brother called Edward Turney. And Edward Turney, and I brought these books along as well, just out of interest, he wrote a book called The Sacrifice of Christ, in which he proposed this first view, a variation of it. And Brother Robert Roberts, encountering that, gave a lecture, and it's in book form. In fact, I think it's... where did I put that? I think it's in this book here called The Slain Lamb. Okay, and so Brother Turney put forward this view called the free life theory. It's a form of substitution up there. And Brother Roberts had to counter that. 20 years later, he encountered another brother called John James Andrews, who wrote a book called The Blood of the Covenant. And again, I have that here, and the 6 years of the magazine that Brother John Andrews then went on to write, called The Sanctuary Keeper, until he died. And he put forward a view which was the complete opposite in the 1890s, a form of legalism, legal condemnation. And Brother Roberts had to counter both of these views. And what he discovered was that although these brethren were Christadelphians, they were in the truth, the views that they put forward led to, in the first case, a form of substitution. And in the second case, a form of legalism. And so Brother Roberts has extensive writings encountering these two views throughout his time as editor of the Christadelphian and his life in the Brotherhood. And so he wrote extensively, and of course many people pick up the writings of Brother Roberts and use them to prove their point of view. And I just say this out of interest. One of the brethren that I mentioned to you earlier, Brother Colin Badger, funnily enough, we often bumped into each other in airports. He was either travelling to the UK or we were travelling to Australia. We would bump into airports. And he talked to me on one occasion, eating our hamburgers at Burger King in the airport there, and he said to me, Steve, and he was heavily involved in the North American reunion efforts while he was alive. But he said, if someone came to me and quoted from the pen of Brother Robert Roberts to prove their point, he said, what I would say to them, I would say, well, tell me, is that quote from the 70s or the 90s? And of course, he wasn't referring to the 1970s or the 1990s, he was referring to the 1870s or the 1890s, because the language of Brother Roberts could be used to prove your point, because encountering this view, he might be using language that seems to favour that view, but encountering that view, he might be using language that favours that view. Whereas Brother Roberts actually was in the centre and was sort of being pushed up either side because of these two extreme views. And so although there are many variants to the two views, most really can be put under the umbrella of these two main views. Now, we hold to the third one, representation, which is the one we introduced last class, and depending on how time goes, we'll get to a point on that, God willing, tonight. But we do hope to show the other two views in their practice, and while we might say we don't subscribe to the doctrine, maybe it's possible that we're living that doctrine. That's what we want to analyse and find out. How do you live substitution? How do you live legalism? What's the implication? What's the moral force behind those doctrines? So I've just simplified it like this on a chart, showing legalism one end and substitution as the two extremes on either end. But there's variations of that leading out to those two extremes, okay? And there's the truth in the centre. And here's Brother Roberts writing. And anyone on that side looks at anything that way and says, oh, that's all substitution. And anyone down this end looking back towards this end says, anything down there is legalism, not knowing that there are these three views, thinking that there's only two views. Now you might say, well, how do you sort of sit right on that line in the middle? Well, in reality, brothers and sisters, this side of the kingdom, we don't in the brotherhood. Okay, we sort of sit within boundaries either side of that centre. And some individuals will focus. They won't necessarily disbelieve or believe the wrong thing, but their focus is on one side or the other. And then ecclesias may favour the focus being on this side or on that side. But there are two clear boundaries which, if you cross over, you are now in the linear line leading down to one of those two extremes. And we'll have a look at this here. I think it's on the fourth night, how this plays out in ecclesial life and living the principles of the atonement, one with another in our ecclesias. So there might be the focus on God's grace, God's goodness, and so the focus is on rejoicing because, well, God is good. He created us, he made us, he is good. But then there's the focus that could be on God's holiness. And focus is on caution because, well, flesh is weak and it will lead to sin. So, we'll have and explore that during our series. So you may have come across some of these phrases before. I've sort of suggested that they really fit under one of those two umbrella views, the two main views in some form. So for substitution, there's Brother Edward Turney's view, the free life theory, the renunciationist theory. Most of the churches around us would subscribe to penal substitution theory. Clean flesh, you might have heard of that phrase in the brotherhood. Continuous obedience, a strand of this substitutional theory. Theistic evolution, I put that in there as well, which we'll have a look at that in a little bit tonight. Whereas legalism, Brother Andrews had this view about some form of legal condemnation, Adamic condemnation that stayed on Adam and all his descendants and had to be removed somehow, in addition to any sins that he committed. And as a name, as a movement, it adopted the name of the brother that promoted it, in this case, Brother Andrews, and so it often is called Andrewism. You might have heard that phrase. Original sin is another form. Sin in the flesh with hyphenations between the words. You might recognise that from our statement of faith in doctrines to be rejected. We reject that there is such a thing as sin in the flesh. And perhaps most recently, many of you might have heard the phrase atonement for nature, which came out more so in the 1990s. So, various names, but really essentially under those two umbrellas. So I've put that there. I'm hoping that, this will inspire you to just go back and dig out some of those books, and if you're young and haven't done it before, to go and start afresh and get this subject under your belt and maybe ask around and see, well, can I do this with someone else or shall I do it on my own? And endeavour to become an expert on this subject, because the Brotherhood will face challenges on this from time to time and is counting on you to stand up at those moments to be counted. Now, we mentioned last class that every doctrine has a moral force behind it. So tonight what we want to do is we want to focus on some fundamentals, areas on the atonement where we differ from everyone else. We put this slide up here. The answers to these questions, I believe, is where we're unique. I don't know of any other religion that puts the same answers to these questions as what we do. From Catholics right through to evangelicals, the spectrum of the religious movement out there, I haven't found someone that has the same answer against all of those points. We're very unique. We see it in a certain way, and we see it that way because we believe that's the truth. But what's the repercussions of seeing it that way in daily life? Could you actually see these things manifested in daily life, and from that see, well, that's really not very good behaviour? Is that what comes out of having this here as a doctrine? I think, and I hope to show it a little bit over the course of these studies, that the behaviour that comes from these doctrines can be seen a mile off. You know what's good and bad behaviour. You may not be able to see the principles as clearly, but when you see the behaviour, you'll know whether the behaviour is good or not. And so from that, work backwards sometimes to say, hey, okay, maybe my understanding on the atonement there isn't up to scratch. Oh, I just thought that for the first one, because in the audience tonight is young and old, and many will have been exposed to the theory of theistic evolution, and so therefore you'll be able to latch into that, perhaps, and for this first look at behaviour coming out of a doctrine, that might, catch everybody who's here tonight. So what we want to do is we want to just have a look at these fundamental principles from certain scriptures, including Ephesians 4. So if you've got Ephesians 4, just leave Ephesians 4 open for a moment and just contemplate some of these verses here. All right? Now, the one that we use in lectures, and we would bring an interested friend to a lecture because that's where it's simple and it's the first principles of the truth, and we would often leave them with the quote, Mark 16, verse 16, "He that believeth the gospel," I put that in italics because it's following on from the verse before in verse 15, "He that believes the gospel and is baptized shall be saved." There's no real wriggle room, is there? That's a fundamental verse, that's why we use it. That word believe, we know, is the word faith. All right? Verb and noun. Pistis. Now, what do you have to believe? Well, Ephesians 4 told us in verse 5 that there's only one belief, only one faith when it comes to salvation. It's not multiple. It's not versions of it that you can pick and choose. It's not a pick and mix when it comes to this subject on the atonement. There's only one. He that believes the gospel. Well, Romans tells us that this is the gospel of God. It's God's gospel. And in Galatians, he actually calls anyone who chooses to believe another gospel as being accursed. Strong language by the apostle. And he repeats those words twice in Galatians, making the point, if you dare teach any other gospel, let that person be accursed. It's the gospel of God. You can't slice it up. You can't change it. You can't make a variant on it. It's God's gospel, and there's only one. He that believeth the gospel and is baptized. Well, Ephesians 4 told us that also, not only is there one faith, there's only one baptism. Shall be saved. Salvation. And Ephesians says that there's only one hope of salvation. And it's all because of God. It's all his. So, what does that mean? Well, the one true gospel, Mark 16, establishes that with these other quotes to support it. There's only one true gospel. This gospel includes things like the doctrine of the atonement. So there's no variations, there's no multiple versions, there's only one. The principles of salvation, there's only one method of salvation. The fundamentals of righteousness, there's only one way to see righteousness. There's only one way to receive forgiveness. All of these things are non-negotiable, they're fundamental. So, let's just go through a little list and see what the answer might be to some of these questions. So is it true that you can say that man was created mortal? Is it possible to say that? If he's made mortal, if he's created mortal, that must mean he was also created prone to sin. That must mean if he was created mortal and prone to sin, that he was also created by God with the carnal mind. Can it be true to say that? Can it be true to say that therefore man was subject to dying before the fall? Not just capable, but subject to dying. That it was inevitable that he was going to die because he was made mortal. And that therefore, the punishment for sin, when God said, in the day you eat, you will die, that death as a punishment was simply an exclusion from eternal life. It wasn't death as you know it, going to the cemetery. Adam was already created deathful. He was already created mortal. So therefore, this punishment must be something else. The exclusion from eternal life, is it fair to say that? Now, thinking through all of those things, is it then fair to say that God saw man like this in Genesis 1 verse 31, yea, he actually created him like this, and it moved God to say that this was very good. Do you think so? That it moved God to say that his creative work, man as the pinnacle, in that state, in that condition, was very good. Well, these are the conclusions reached by those promulgating the doctrine of theistic evolution. Okay, so if you weren't aware of that, that's the premise. That God made man mortal from the beginning, which therefore meant he must have been prone to sin, he must have had the carnal mind, he must have been subject to dying before he actually sinned, before he fell. And that the fall wasn't to become mortal, because he already was. The fall was that he would be excluded from eternal life. Now, clearly that impacts solely and squarely on our understanding of the atonement, doesn't it? Fundamentally, that changes some of the answers that we had in that slide of all of those fundamentals. I think it was the previous slide. Oh no, it wasn't. Well, we won't go back there. The questions that we've had in the Brotherhood for years, the answers to those fundamentals have been changed. Those that push it would say, well, that's nothing to worry about. We're not changing anything fundamental. Well, quite frankly, such a statement is a monstrous lie, an absurdity. Or it's said in utter naivety. Whichever case, it's wrong. It's different. But if we're going to have a look at substitution being wrong because of its impact on the atonement, and legalism is wrong because of its impact on the atonement, well, theistic evolution is just as wrong, since it fundamentally changes the one true gospel into another gospel. So what would be the moral force behind the doctrine of theistic evolution? What do you think? What would be the manifestation of that as a living practice? If you honestly believed that as a doctrine, how would it be manifested? Well, last time we did this series, of course, this wasn't something that had entered our vocabulary, theistic evolution. So, this is new for working out how this might be seen in behaviour, but I think it's quite powerful, because here's some of the underlying principles that govern evolution. And each one, I just want you to think about, well, how would that be seen in practice? Natural selection and adaption. My experience with brethren that have adopted this doctrine is that they actually adapt quickly to new situations. And that is to fit in more, for survival, for relevance, to be seen as being relevant. Survival of the fittest. In other words, it's quite okay for the weak to die out, because the whole principle is the survival of the fittest, to promote yourself, even if it means persecuting others. So there's no guilt in attacking others, whether that's verbally or even physically, but verbally or character assassinate, to persecute them, to rise above them. There's no consequences for abuse, you see. Oldies get left behind. Well, so what? Need to move with the times, need to adapt, need to change. Mutation and random change. So mutation, something that, suddenly sort of grows something that's not been seen in that species before, gets adapted and mutated to become a strength. Mutation. This one here has been quite evident to me, where a brother has put his version of what he thinks he believes on this, and you get version 1, and then you get version 2, and then you get version 3, and then it mutates more, and then you get version 32, and then you get version 45, and you really don't know what their final view is, because it's constantly changing. You can't pin it down. There's multiple theories on evolution. Just a quick search on Google will find that out. Well, the same practice happens when this is lived. Death and decay. Death and decay. Well, if an ecclesia dies out, well, it's to be expected. Debate and strife are welcomed. It's part of life. This is necessary. And perhaps the one that you might have come across more so than the others, simplicity to complexity. So the simple cell eventually evolves into, the highest form of living, man himself, from simplicity to complexity. And of course, I've come across this quite often where, Steve, you're inferior. You don't know enough. You haven't done the science. You can't comment. You're not qualified. I'm the one filled with the scientific knowledge. I'm superior to you. You're the inferior. You're the simple. I'm the complex. Now, they don't say it like that, but that's clearly living what they believe. And you'd expect it. I wouldn't expect anything else, because that's their doctrine. And if you're going to be honest to your doctrine, you'll live that. Now, I just want to show you this have a look at this doctrine in all its ugliness in an event that took place back in 1998. Some of you may have been alive and remembered this amongst the older ones, but the younger ones may not be aware of this, where 2 teenage lads massacred in a space of about 32 minutes 12 students and 1 teacher. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, what's become known as the Columbine Shootings Massacre. Now, I'm not sure if you're able to read that. I try to get it as big as possible without doing multiple slides. These 2 lads lived evolution. They loved the doctrine of evolution, or the theory of evolution. So this one lad called Eric, he wrote in his diary on that day or in that week before, sometime in April, he says, we will get revenge. We will kick natural selection up a few notches. Well, what did he mean by that? Well, during the attack, I'm just going to read the pink bits. If you wanted to see the article for yourself, you're welcome to come and ask. During the attack, Eric Harris was wearing a T-shirt that read Natural Selection. He and Klebold were firm believers in Darwinian evolution, as indicated by the videos and website that Harris had published. Both boys had a fascination for Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection and felt that they were going to be natural killers by demonstrating evolution's protocol that only the strongest survives. So they're putting into action what they believed. This is the natural outcome in practice of this doctrine. During the attack, Eric Harris was wearing a T-shirt that read Natural Selection. The Columbine murderers considered themselves superior to their peers. In their minds, they were superhuman, a new species moving up the evolutionary tree, similar to the fictional characters in a film that they'd seen. Harris wrote the following entry in his diary. I feel like God, and I wish I was, having everyone being officially lower than me. I already know that I am higher than most anyone. And he posted this. You know what I love? Natural selection. It's the best thing that ever happened to Earth, getting rid of all the stupid and weak organisms, but it's all natural, yes. And then the comment at the very bottom there, if you can see it with the blue around it, the evolutionary connection to the Columbine killers is so real that you'd have to be blind to miss it. So that's the extreme on this doctrine. But I think we can see some of those things come out in an emotional way or in a verbal way by many who espouse this as a doctrine without going to the extent of being physical in their behaviour. It's quite telling, isn't it? So you see, that's living evolution, whether it's theistic or not. So that's what we're meaning. When you take a doctrine, what's the outcome? What's the practice that goes with it? Well, one area where we're very unique on the atonement is that we put God as the prime mover behind it, where we say every part of it is possible because of him, because he only can make it happen, and he knows best. So therefore, he makes it happen because he knows the best way. He's the instigator, he's the implementer, he's the maintainer of every aspect of the atonement. Nothing is left out, nothing is left to others, nothing is left to man, that's for sure. In short, he is the focus and centre of the atonement. It's all about God. Now, I'm just going to go through some quotes without turning them up, and you'll recognise immediately that God is the centre of every aspect of this subject. You see, Abraham was told that God would provide a lamb when Isaac said, well, where's the lamb? I've got the wood. You've got the fire. Where's the lamb? God himself will provide the lamb. God's going to be involved. David was told in the promises, God would be his father. He shall be my son, but I'll be his father. The prophet Isaiah said that God would cause a virgin to conceive. It would be a work of God, you see. Galatians, Paul says that God sent forth his son at the very right time, born of a woman, made under the law. In Acts 2, when Peter gives his speech on the day of Pentecost, he says, yes, Jesus did miracles, wonders and signs, but he said, which God did by him. It wasn't Jesus doing it, it was God doing it through Jesus. In the next verse after, in Acts chapter 2 there, it was God's counsel and foreknowledge that would be determined when his son would be delivered. It wasn't Pontius Pilate or Caiaphas that would determine. It was God's counsel and foreknowledge. It was God, Paul says in Romans 8, who would condemn sin in the flesh. It was God who would raise and did raise his son, Jesus Christ. Why? Well, so that ultimately, says Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, that God might be seen to be all in all. It's all about God. You see, the Buddhists out there put Buddha at the centre, this lifeless stone or gold images which they put in their lives. Many different aspects are put at the centre of people's lives in religious circles, but the churches mainly out there put Jesus at the centre. All the focus is on Jesus because they believe Jesus is God. So they're saying, well, we're putting God at the centre, but no, you're not. You're putting Jesus at the centre. You're making Jesus equal with God. You're saying they're the same, that they're equal. So the focus for you is on the importance of equality in practice. And you'll see that, especially in the evangelical movements, it's all about equality. Well, Jesus is equal with God, and so equality in the church. But what does knowing that God is the centre and forefront of our salvation, what does knowing that mean in practice? How would you live that? How should you live that as a doctrine, as a principle? Because it is a principle. And we would contend with anyone that would change that and say, no, Jesus is just as important. He's the focus. He's the centre. We would say no. How would you live? What's the moral force behind that? Well, I think it's quite clear. It's plainly obvious, I feel. The moral force is that everything we do should be done with God centre and forefront of our lives. He should be the focus and motive behind every decision we make. Why? Well, because he knows best. Don't leave it to man to make your decisions. Leave it to God. Let him help you. Any decision made without God's involvement is clearly open to failure. And it's fraught with holes. We need to put God at the centre. So I just want you to visualise, what does that mean, putting God at the centre of your life? Just sort of try to create a chart to just give a visual on this. So here's your life, an individual's life. God needs to be at the centre. He needs to be at the centre of your personal life. So your family needs to be thought about with God in mind. Prayer needs to be thought about with God in mind. The ecclesia needs to be thought about and acted in with God in mind. Your brothers and sisters, your personal life needs God at the centre. Your career, what you do from 9 till 5, for most people. What's your career, your work, whether you're at work or you're still at TAFE or school or uni? What's your job choice? Is it done with God in mind? What's the culture of your employment? How do you treat work colleagues? Is it done with God at the centre? And here's a crucial one. After 9 till 5, when you put tools down and you have your leisure time and no pressure from ecclesial life or family life and you can just relax, how do you occupy your time? Is it done with God in mind? Where you go on your holidays? what restaurant, what you watch, what hobbies you take up? Is it done with God at the forefront of your mind? I just want you to come to Romans chapter 1, because the Apostle Paul gives a very clear indication as to what happens when you move God from the centre and put him to the side. You don't remove him, but you just push him from the centre. So just 2 verses here. Romans 1, not a very nice chapter. The Roman world. How did it get so bad? Why? Because of these 2 things. In Romans 1, verse 18 to 27 is a little section describing how the people had forgotten, had replaced God and changed, verse 23, the glory of God into an image. You see, they'd replaced God. They'd taken God out of their minds and replaced him with an image made like unto corruptible man, birds, 4-footed beasts and creeping things, says verse 23. Well, what happens when you replace God and you push him to the side and you bring other things into the centre? Well, over time, if you do that long enough and often enough, you'll eventually forget God. He's on the sort of edge. He's been pushed to the side. And so in verse 28, Paul says that's exactly what happened. They didn't want to retain God in their knowledge. Eventually, he was taken right out of their realm of thinking. They forgot him. So what happens if you replace God from the centre? Eventually, you'll forget him. And days could go by, weeks could go by. I haven't thought about how God's involved in my life. Months could even go by. Possible to even leave the truth and then completely forget. So this idea of making God the centre is really number one fundamental on the atonement, and it should be seen in our lives. So the question is, what's at the centre of your life? Right, so visualise this again. There's the question mark. What's right there in the centre? Is God still there? Or has he been pushed to the side? Been replaced with maybe entertainment now is the focus. It's all about gaming or computers. Or maybe work's taken over. Work's now the centre. Everything's focused and all decisions are made just based on work. God's not involved. He's been pushed to the side. You see, life is a struggle to keep God at the centre. I know you know that. I know that. To keep him at the centre. But did you know that keeping him at the centre is actually a fundamental part of the atonement? That's why it's important. And although it's a struggle, be absolutely assured, brothers and sisters and young people, that your life will be much better if he is at the centre. That's the point, because he knows best. He'll make it happen, just the same as he's made the atonement happen, because he knows best. Is your life centred around your computer or your car or your clothes or the office or sport or sports heroes? Or even centred perhaps around your children, your family? You know, many religious people, now just because someone's religious doesn't mean that they are God-centred, is the point. Many religious people have replaced God and put in the centre, some have put Jesus Christ there, others have put traditions, believing that kissing St. Peter's big toe has more benefits than a personal prayer to God. Or good, honest people, charity workers in the main, put piety at the centre. And of course, the United Nations Charter on Human Rights has put humanism at the centre, and that's the one that we have to combat with the most today, isn't it? So I guess a question to go home thinking about tonight is, what can you start to do more to be seen as God-centred in your life? What's one thing perhaps you could do tomorrow that would be more God-centred, make God the focus? You see, the atonement depended entirely on God for its success. Well, that means, do you depend entirely on God for your day-to-day living success as well? Do you involve him in everything that you do? Can you see how this, as a doctrine, does have an application? Another area of the atonement where we differ is that we say that there are two things that we need to live the atonement. Come to 2 Corinthians chapter 5. We had this as a reading last class. 2 Corinthians chapter 5. The Apostle Paul here, this is a marvellous section. We may get on to sort of some point in this series talking about why did Paul write 2 Corinthians at all, and particularly chapter 3 to 5, in particular chapter 5, which uses this word atonement or reconciliation more times than anywhere else in the New Testament. It's all here in 2 Corinthians 5. Paul says this in verse 12. For we commend not ourselves again unto you, but give you occasion to glory on our behalf, that ye may have somewhat to answer them which glory in appearance and not in heart. For whether we be beside ourselves. Now, I just want to break this verse down a little bit. There's two elements to this verse that I think are important. Uncle John taught me this many years ago, and I thought, wow, I didn't see it myself. But he teased it open, and he demonstrated that there's two things going on here. What's to be beside yourself mean? Well, it's an emotional feeling. To be beside yourself, you know, that feeling, that emotion where you're so scared or happy that you jump out of your skin and you're beside yourself. It's an emotional phrase, expression, isn't it? It's an emotional move. So sometimes, says Paul, I'm like that. I'm emotionally moved. When I do that, it's to God. Or whether we be sober. Oh, that's quite different to being emotionally moved and in the moment and jumping out of your skin and being beside yourself. This is when you're quite cold and calculated and serious and deliberate. The RSV says, whether we be in our right mind. All right, someone that's sober has got all their senses and they can make good judgments. So Paul says, whether I'm emotionally moved or whether I'm thinking straight, it's to God or it's for your cause. It's the same thing. Why? How come he acts this way? How come he can be so extreme? One minute be emotionally moved and the next minute be totally cold and thinking straight? Well, because the love of Christ compelled me, he says. That's why I'm emotionally moved. The love of Christ just touched me that I just sometimes feel passionate and emotionally involved in all that Christ did. His love compels me. Because we thus judge. Oh, now that's different. That's different to love. The love of Christ compels me, but I'm also able to make a judgment. This judging is to make an assessment, to make a calculation, to come to a specific decision. So, on the one hand, his heart is being involved, while at the very same time, his head's being involved. What Paul is saying is both his head and his heart are working together. He's not just all heart, and he's not just all head. And in that way, he says in verse 15, and that he died for all, that they which live should not henceforth live unto themselves, but unto him which died for them and rose again. Live unto Christ in our hearts and our minds. Love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and mind, says Deuteronomy 6. So you see, what this is telling us, brothers and sisters, is that it's not just enough to have correct doctrine. To say, I understand the truth and I believe the truth. You have to be moved by it as well. You have to feel passionate about it. It has to bring emotions to it. Alternatively, you could be a very loving person, all right, full of warmth and compassion, but if it's all brought about by wrong doctrine, then really it's all just fluff, isn't it? Fluffy and nice, but meaningless. You feel good, but it's ineffective. You see, the atonement must be on the basis of two things: truth and love. The two of them go hand in hand. The reason being is because if this is the gospel of God and he's the centre, what's God like? Well, God's character has these two twin pillars of truth, emeth, and love, kindness, chesed, mercy. Emeth is the principles, the right and wrong of something, the logic and the thinking behind things. It addresses the method. What's the outline? What's the structure? What's the detail? An engineer needs to know the principles of his engineering, doesn't he? How's the method of making a bridge going to turn out if I don't apply the principles? It appeals to the mind and it demands an intellectual response, says Paul. And he brings that intellectual response. He says, I judge this is right. Absolutely. No question. But chesed isn't principles, it's acts. Acts of kindness, acts of goodness. Is often translated as the word goodness and mercy. It's the feelings and emotions behind things. It addresses the motive, not the method, the motive. Is it sincere? Is it caring? Is it forgiving? What's the attitude? And it appeals to the heart and demands an emotional response. So what Paul is saying is that when it comes to the atonement, it needs to draw out of you and me both an intellectual response and an emotional response. You can't just have one without the other. You need both. God's character is both. This is the twin pillars of his character on which the atonement is built. Now, we know this. Jesus said these words in John to the woman of Samaria. They that worship the Father must worship him in spirit, the word sincerity, and in truth. The two of them, you see? They go together. You can't just worship him in truth and have no emotional investment at all. You can't just be all lovey and it's, Jesus loved me, so therefore, I'm saved. If there's no truth behind it. It needs both. And of course, we won't turn to 2nd of John, but the apostle in 2nd of John brings these two together quite extensively. But I do want you to go to Ephesians 4, which we had as our reading, to see a phrase here that I think is one of the most beautiful verses in Scripture, one of my favourite verses in Scripture because of the power that's found within it. How do you go about living the character of God, these twin pillars, the fundamental bases of the atonement? If you don't have these, you don't have the atonement. Well, this is what Paul says here, having gone on from talking about there's only one gospel, there's only one faith, one Lord, one baptism. In verse 15, or verse 14 for connection, that we henceforth be no more children tossed to and fro, carried about with every wind of doctrine, by the sleight of men and cunning craftiness whereby they lie in wait to deceive, but speaking the truth in love, may grow up into him in all things, which is the head, even Christ. This word, speaking the truth, is one word. It's the Greek word, and I looked it up to see how to pronounce this properly, eleuthiome, I should say, eleuthiome. It's actually a verb, all right, which is a bit hard to put in the text, so they've put the word speaking the truth, but actually, it actually means that the best way to translate it is to do truth, but do it in love. So I've put in my margin here that the way to really understand that is to go about truthing in love. That's what the word is. The word truthing, it's a verb. Okay, but when you go out there truthing and saying what the principles of the truth are, when you do those acts of truth, do it in love. Couch it in love. Do it in compassion. Truthing in love. Now, just out of interest, over the last few classes, we've also had brethren do talks on Revelation, the 7 ecclesias. Did you know that there were 2 ecclesias that highlight these aspects? Ephesus and Thyatira. One I've called the hard ecclesia, the other I've called the soft ecclesia. This one was doctrinally sound, but it had no love. This one had more love than you can ever hope to imagine, but they didn't have the truth. They were tolerant of Jezebel. They didn't stand up for truth. These ones here had lost their first love. The 2 ecclesias, if they just combined and brought those aspects together, would have been a wonderful ecclesia. But Jesus has to address this one here had lost its love, this one here had lost the truth. So, as we finish up for tonight, brothers and sisters, where do you fit in on the truth-love spectrum when dealing with your brothers and sisters and your family and your wife or your husband or your parents? What do you need to work on maybe? Well, are you unbending, dogmatic, black and white, zealous, which is good to hold the truth together, but doesn't hold the warmth of the truth together? Or are you always just passionate, emotional, compromising and accommodating, but when the time comes to stand up for truth, find it a challenge? I've just put some characters there who had to address some of these things in their own lives. Elijah, cold, very often. Poor Obadiah. Jonah, very calculating. John and James, sons of thunder, okay, had to learn to show this emotional side of God's love. Whereas Peter, Samson, Jehoshaphat had to learn to stand sometimes for just the truth because of their character. So, brothers and sisters, I can't answer that question for you, where you fit. But just think about, next time you go in hard to try and stand for truth, do it in love. Or if someone's messing around with doctrines, yes, be kind and compassionate, but make sure you're still able to convey where the truth lies, so that, God willing, the process of the atonement may be working in our lives when Jesus Christ comes back as the manifestation of God to give us immortality, whereby we'll be able to show those 2 characteristics perfectly in the age to come.